once we've taken all the grid lines from the architectural model, we've taken all the elevations, we've taken the project standards and made sure that the location data is correct, the next thing to do is actually start linking in any other models, right? So then I'd start linking in the structural, the steel model, the MEP model if there's a consultant on the project, and continue onwards. So the first thing that I'll do is I only have a structural model which I want to locate and link in here. The way we do that is by going to the Insert tab, Link Revit, and you can find where you've saved it on your computer. In this case, I have this structure, and you can double click that, right? Just a note, if you're using BIM 360 or you've collaborated it in the cloud, you need Autodesk Desktop Connector, which is going to be, once you go to your PC, it should say something called Autodesk Desktop Connector. Once you click that, you can navigate on the cloud to the server and select the links which you want, right? But for now, let's pretend that we've navigated there and we have this structure. So if you click this and click open, it's going to start linking everything in, and it's going to say the following nested links will not appear. You can say close to that, because what that's saying is there were some links which were initially inside the structural, they're not going to come, which is obviously correct because those links were just there so that they could model, right? We don't want these. So if you go to your 3D view, you'll see that there's a lot of grid lines here, and there's just a lot of clutter everywhere. Because what we've done is we've actually linked in the structural model, and you can see because there's a bunch of reference lines and reference planes which have been added as well. If we go and click this, you can see that it says basic project structure. So that this is the structural model which has been added. The thing which I like to do when I add a LinkedIn model is I like to pin it. So you click this and click pin, right? You want to make sure though that everything has been linked in correctly. So when I select this structure, I want to make sure that my grid lines are actually aligning to ABC, and that my grid lines over here, so this is grid 2, is it aligning correctly? So I can see that grid 5 is not aligning. So grid 5 is up here. Let's just move this slightly over and see what's happening. So you have grid line 1, which has to align to this. And you have grid line 2, which is just past it. You have grid line 3. And you have grid line 4, right? And it seems like for some strange reason that the structure is actually not matching with the architecture. So let's move this away and let's align everything. So the way that I do this is I go AL on the keyboard, click this, and then I click the structural grid line here. It's going to align it that way, and then I do it the other way. So I try to find where's my grid line. Okay, this is my grid line, and I go AL and I align this with the structural grid line. And you'll see that the structural model has actually created their grid lines incorrectly, because they have an additional, they put their F grid line here and they have 2 extra grid lines. They've also added their grid line 2 over here, which is very close to grid line 1. So that's actually an error in the structural file, because what you can actually see is that everything has been not properly aligned. When we align it to grid line 1, this is, the structure is off center. So if I click escape and I align, let's align grid line 2 to grid line 1. You'll see that now everything links in properly. So your structure is actually on the proper architectural thing, and you'll see that you just have this additional grid line 2, which doesn't have a grid line. And then everything is sort of like on the opposite direction. So if you click this structure, you'll see grid line 5 is over here, but the grid line 5 of our drawing is down here, right? So what I've seen now is I linked in the structure. It seems to be in the correct place, but the grid lines are incorrect, and that's because structure hasn't properly communicated with architecture and they haven't copy monitored grid lines. So this is actually a brilliant example for why you need to properly copy monitor grid lines at the start, because if structure doesn't communicate with architecture and architecture changes their grid lines later on, doesn't let structure know, then you have opposing grid lines and you can't link things properly. So it's really important you communicate this, and at this point in the project, I would send an email or send an AConnex to the structural or the builder or the architect and let them know what the issue is so they can go and fix these grid lines and then resend the model. Even though we've actually aligned our structural grid lines with our mechanical template grid lines, we have to make sure that our levels are also aligned, right? In this case, we're pretty confident that the structure has been placed on top of the architecture. The grid lines are just wrong, right? And that's very obvious and we can see that. But we want to make sure that in our elevation view, at least we have the correct elevation and the structure is not off center in terms of elevation. So if we go to our any section view or any elevation view, we can turn off. What I would do is I would click VV or type VV, go to Revit Links, and I'm going to turn off my basic sample project and I'm just going to leave on my structural project. What that's going to do is get rid of my architecture, and it's just going to be Revit template, which I have with my copy monitored grids as well as the structure, right? As you can see, if we select our structure here, our structural model, we can check to see if our level 1 is aligned with level 1, same with everything else, right? And you might want to shift it up and then use the align command just to make sure that it's to the millimeter correct 100%. And once we've done that, that's when you should pin it and then continue onwards, right? So grid lines, align it, elevation, align it. Those are the two important things before you actually pin your model in place.